All right, why don't we go ahead and get started? Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining on this beautiful day. I'm Jake War. I am with Trillium Solutions for one more day, and then I am moving on to another pursuit. And I've been working on this project with Stephanie Millar at ODOT for the last several months. Here, with me, who has been working with me on this project, is Weston. I'll let Weston introduce himself.
Yeah, hi. Hope everyone's doing well. I'm Weston, just a junior consultant with Trillium as well. And happy to dig into some shared mobility data topics here today.
Thanks, Weston. So I'm guessing some of you were on the webinar yesterday with Alta Planning about the state of shared mobility as overall and impacts that COVID has had. This project was focused on the data behind shared mobility and that's involved in shared mobility. So the idea was to create a primer for particularly medium and smaller communities in the state as a resource for them. So I'm going to go over what the project entailed and all that. If you have a couple housekeeping issues, so there's a chat box, should be in the lower right of your screen. If you want to type questions in there, I think that's the best way to handle it, and then we'll answer those at the end. I have everyone on mute, and I don't think you have control of that. If you particularly want to say something, you can also plop that in the chat, and I'll unmute you. So yeah, I think besides that, we'll go ahead and get started. So the overview of where we'll go on this webinar journey today, we're going to give some basic definitions as a starting point, just so we're all on the same page about what we're talking about here when we refer to shared mobility data and such. We'll give you the context of this project, why it came about, and what it's meant to do. We'll give you a summary of the actual document, the primer, and then we'll take some questions at the end. So the basic definitions to get started. I'm reminded one more thing. We are recording this webinar. So I think it will record the chat, but I'm not 100% sure. I'm pretty sure it does. Anyway, so we are recording this webinar. We'll also be happy to provide the slides afterwards. Back to basic definitions. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with shared mobility, but for the purposes of this project, we're talking about simply transportation services that users share rather than own, including ride sourcing like TNCs, even taxis, as taxis are commonly developing apps that you're able to hail them similarly as you would in Uber or Lyft, car share, bike share, e-scooter share, and microtransit, which has been an emerging mode that enables folks to request rides from smaller vehicles, and routes are dynamically created based on the requests that the system gets. Note that we are not including public transit in this. It is often considered under shared mobility, but for this project, we're specifically focusing on these modes. So shared mobility data, we're defining as basically the information that's generated in the operation of these shared mobility services. There's a whole variety of information. It can include details about the trips taken, locations of vehicles, sizes of fleets. There's financial transactions, of course, crash and safety information, a whole variety of other data that's generated and used during the course of providing and using shared mobility services. So in terms of the context and the purpose of this project, especially before COVID, we were seeing a lot of shared mobility services emerging throughout the state, in not just Portland, not just Eugene, but smaller communities throughout. We were seeing them in Medford and Ashland with bike share. We're seeing in Milwaukee, which is part of the Portland Metro, but smaller communities. There's a car share pilot in Hood River, and of course TNCs throughout the state in various areas. And the issue with this is really that they produce so much data, and there's so many considerations around that data that we were really seeing that communities were not, and jurisdictions were not quite prepared to know what to do with this data. We had a first phase of this project where we did a scan of shared mobility services in Oregon to see what they were doing with the data, how they were creating policies and ordinances around this data. And essentially it was some of the bigger communities and cities with the resources and the technical capacity. They were figuring out kind of what to do, but there wasn't a lot of guidance for the smaller communities. So really the question was, how can we help educate and prepare jurisdictions so that they can get the most out of this data? And this is a key piece, while protecting personal privacy, because that is such a huge concern with any data that has to do with travel, that has to do with where people are located, where they're picking up vehicles. That can really reveal a lot about people's just day-to-day activity, which could be used for nefarious purposes. But then just general privacy, I think people want to be able to go about their business without being able to be identified as what they're doing. So we decided to create this primer as part of this ODOT and using an ODOT Innovations grant. And the structure of it has essentially 6 sections. There's a glossary of a bunch of shared mobility data terms and some just general shared mobility terms, so that we're on the same page of understanding about what we're talking about. Most of it is for the purpose of supporting the document itself, but it's also a useful glossary just in general for people to familiarize themselves with the lingo. We have chapter 1 that's focused on understanding just the basic concepts of shared mobility data. We have chapter 2 that's about developing policies surrounding shared mobility data. Chapter 3, some good practices, and you'll note the phrase "good practices" rather than best. This is a new area. We're all kind of trying to figure out this whole world of shared mobility. So we say good practices because best practices really haven't emerged yet. We provide some summaries of third-party data analysis tools that are out there on the market that jurisdictions might consider to support their use of this data. And then finally, we provide some informational resources for further guidance and education around shared mobility data. And you see at the bottom, this is meant as a starting point. It's a primer that's in the name. So it's meant to really just be a stepping off point that supports jurisdictions as they go down this path. It's not a comprehensive resource that'll answer every question that you have about shared mobility data. So now we'll go through some the summaries of the chapters. So chapter 1, like I said, is about understanding just the basic concepts of shared mobility data. We give an overview of open data, which at Trillium, we're big proponents of open data. We think it's a particularly important tool for in the transportation world, just like we see with the general transit feed specification, GTFS. The emergence of that, which if you don't know, and probably many of you do, came out of a partnership between TriMet and Google. It is the standard for transit data, how it appears on Google Maps and other applications that enable people to plan trips on transit. And so it's an open specification in the sense that the structure of it is determined by committee, by the community. People can be involved in that process. And it is available. A lot of GTFS feeds are available for anyone to use, for those third-party apps to consume, so that they can present that information about transit systems around the world. Similarly, and what this primer focuses on in this chapter is GBFS, the General Bike Share Feed Specification, and MDS, the Mobility Data Specification. So GBFS, important thing to note about it is it's user-facing. So this is how you're able to access information about bike share, location of bike share bikes, and their availability. MDS, on the other hand, is agency-facing. So the city or whatever entity is managing a shared mobility program, this enables them to see information about the system, a whole host of data about it that I'll give you some examples in just a sec. But it's not for public consumption. It's for the agency that's in charge of the program. So this screenshot here, which I believe is the Transit app, it looks a lot like the Transit app, but I'm not 100% sure. It is an example of how GBFS presents in an application. So it shows, like I said, location of available bikes. In the case of dockless bike systems, it can also present the dock locations and show how many bikes are there versus how many spaces. So if you're riding one and you need to park it at a dock, you can see if there's availability there. And it does this in real time, which is obviously crucial for people using a bike share system. And it's also used for e-scooter share systems. Probably a lot of you have used them, and that GBFS is what makes that doable. MDS, the Mobility Data Specification, on the other hand, as I said, it's agency facing, and this is an example of what the LA DOT, their dashboard has. So they're able to pull in MDS data and see, for example, here, not just where vehicles are available, but where they have been taken from, which ones are currently reserved. They get that whole comprehensive view of a bike share fleet and the system. A lot of this information wouldn't be as useful to a user. Where a bike was removed from, I don't really care. I just want to see where a bike is and where, like say, where a service area is. MDS, an important point that I should make about MDS is agencies are also able to push information to MDS. So certain like service areas, like I said, there are policy elements that they can push to MDS. So it can be a two-way communication street. Another example that the LA DOT does in leveraging MDS data is they combine it with their tool CalEnviroscreen to look at equity outcomes and to see with their providers of mobility services, are they complying with the requirements to serve certain areas based on different demographics, et cetera. So you can layer this information using other data sources to make it a really useful and robust tool and robust data standard to be able to evaluate your program, see if policy outcomes are being achieved, see if providers are complying with those policies and ordinances and regulations, et cetera. So chapter 2 it focuses on policy development. It provides guidance as jurisdictions are looking to launch a program. And what we really want to accomplish here is we want to help jurisdictions see how they can use this shared mobility data support the overall program goals and objectives. So there might be a variety of goals that a jurisdiction wants to accomplish through a shared mobility service or program. And data is really necessary for that in terms of transportation planning goals, equity goals, like I said, just general mobility goals and access goals for the residents of an area. You need the data to be able to measure whether those are being accomplished and also get some insight into how they can be accomplished. So the process that we recommend is a 4-step process. And it includes a lot of these have a series of questions that we recommend that jurisdictions ask as they're going through this process. Starting with laying the groundwork, making sure that those who are going to be responsible and involved in a shared mobility program, that they are educated on the laws and regulations and statutes and anything related to shared mobility data. So does a state like in Oregon, what's the status of the data that TNCs have to share or don't have to share? How is personally identifiable information or PII? What are the protections there at a legislative level, et cetera? And just learning about, like, for example, this primer could be a good start for that. What are data specifications? What are the data specifications relevant to shared mobility? 2, we recommend establishing shared mobility data goals, specifically goals for that data. And that, that is going to come from the goals for the overall program. But we think it's important that you look at what are you really trying to accomplish with these goals, with this data? How is it going to support the overall program? And then from there, you can move to step 3, which is specifically narrowing in on what the scope of that data is, how it's going to be protected in reality. So you can start to look at what do we want to collect as a jurisdiction that's going to support those program goals? What level of detail do we need? What formats are we going to require the providers to publish their data in? Are we going to require MDS? Are we going to require GBFS? And then as far as how and who is going to be involved with that data, how is it going to be collected? Where is it going to be stored? How long is it going to be kept? Who has access to it? We think that it's important to identify that from the get-go, so it's not just reactionary and all of a sudden there's all this data and maybe we want data, but we didn't decide we wanted it until the service was on the road. I think it's important to really make that clear. And then from there, drafting the actual policies. They don't have to be set regulations, although there are, we'll go over where regulations and ordinances can be useful tools. But either way, drafting those policies getting ahead of the game, ahead of when the services are on the street, is crucial. So we also in the primer, we provide a data sharing agreement framework that jurisdictions can use. We suggest a declaration of shared mobility data principles that can be a good resource, and all of that is linked in the primer. One of the pieces we highlight is a decision tree for this policy-making process. Hopefully you can see it's a little blurry because it's a screenshot, but it shows there that, again, like we're recommending, you start with the project objectives, and that's really what informs the process of getting to what you need in that data agreement with the shared mobility provider, and how that's going to support the overall project or program. So I'm going to turn it over to Weston to take it away on starting with chapter 3.
Yeah, thanks, Jake. So in chapter 3, we give a list of 7 recommendations, which we, as Jake touched on consider to be good practices. The first one of those is strategic RFPs. And we recommend jurisdictions are the ones that should take the initiative to implement shared mobility programs, as it gives them the advantage of shaping programs to meet their desired outcomes. RFPs allow jurisdictions to be intentional and proactive rather than risking surprise deployments of shared mobility services. And just as an example of that kind of surprise deployment, I'm sure some of you...
we've got a comment in the chat that someone can't hear you. Will other people post in the chat if that's occurring for you too? Because I can hear you. Well, not sure. But hopefully, I don't know, maybe.
Let's see, is there like a call-in number that I could call instead? Or someone else is typing here, so let's see what they say.
Okay, so it might be something on your end, Steve, but if you didn't have trouble hearing me, I'm not sure what the issue is. But why don't you go ahead?
All right, yeah. Fortunately, we're recording this, so if you miss this bit, you can always go back and catch it. So as I was saying, just to give an example, there have been some cases in which e-scooters have just shown up on the streets, and those situations cause jurisdictions to react rather than plan. The next recommendation we give is implementing pilot programs. Pilots allow jurisdictions to evaluate shared mobility services without committing to certain companies or long-term programs. Jurisdictions can apply the lessons that they've learned from those pilots to shared mobility programs going forward. And then we also talk about codified data requirements. And the purpose of including these data requirements when drafting regulations is really to ensure that these requirements are clear and enforceable. It also establishes a jurisdiction's general authority to impose data requirements as a condition of shared mobility operations. Regulations can include language like, quote, operators must provide accurate data through a publicly accessible application programming interface that meets the requirements of GBFS, end quote. Or another example, quote, operators must provide quarterly data reports to the city on key performance indicators, including but not limited to the following, etc. And then if someone is interested in seeing what this looks like in more detail, the primer does include some examples of code language taken from places like College Park, Georgia, Santa Monica, as well as others. And then we also talk about open source data specifications as part of our good practices recommendations. We've touched on GBFS and MDS and their ubiquity in the realm of shared mobility already, but it is worth restating here that requiring the use of these open source data specifications is essential to the success of a shared mobility program. And then user surveys. The supplemental data that a jurisdiction may need to measure program success, for example, the demographic information likely needed to meet equity outcomes, can be collected through optional anonymous user surveys. And then we list privacy risk assessments. As Jake touched on a little previously, privacy protection should be a top priority, and jurisdictions should assess the potential ways that user privacy could be compromised and assess the strategies to mitigate that risk. This is of particular importance for smaller jurisdictions, as it is harder to anonymize data from a smaller pool of users. And then our last recommendation that we list is using data to manage sidewalk space. One of the major complaints the public often voices when scooters, as mentioned, start showing up in their cities is when they're parked on sidewalks or other places that create problems for pedestrians. And shared mobility data can actually help resolve some of these issues by informing decisions on where to install designated parking spaces off of those sidewalks in those problem areas, and also can allow jurisdictions to enforce parking rules by defining those parking boundaries and actually fining riders when they violate them. And then in the primer, we provide jurisdictions with a snapshot list of what tools exist to help make sense of the kind of data that we're talking about in Chapter 4. These tools vary on price structure, their distinguishing features, level of support, and the DOTs and agencies that are currently using them. However, they do provide similar core functions, and we can see some of those examples of those functions here. On the top left, we can see a historical heat map of parking locations of shared mobility vehicles. On the top right is a historical visualization of different vehicle trips and the density of the routes that they take. And then the bottom left is just another example of different data visualizations that you can get from these dashboards. And then lastly, on the bottom right there is an example of what a real-time map would look like that indicates current available vehicle locations. And then the last chapter, informational resources, includes some next step resources that we recommend for jurisdictions who have fully digested the primer and are seriously looking into starting a shared mobility program. And to give an idea of what those resources look like, we have an example here of the New Urban Mobility Alliance's website, where you can actually browse use cases under specific outcomes. So in this example, we've selected safety as the outcome that we're looking for use cases related to that. And selecting that would result in kind of a list of different cards related to safety. If we clicked on one of those cards, it would bring us to this portal where we can see different evaluation metrics to reach those safety outcomes, the specific data points that are needed to do that evaluation, as well as some other related articles around safety in the realm of shared mobility. And that about wraps up the shared mobility primer. So thank you.